Good morning. Thank you, Jim, for really introducing, I think, the beginning of my presentation. As Jim talked about, an estimated 12 million arrests are made each year. Of those arrests, 11.6 million people are admitted to local jails. And we house nearly 750,000 people every day in local jails in an annual cost of $8 billion. Local taxpayers bear those costs. Over 60% of jail inmates are pending trial, accused of a crime, awaiting court action. With each one of those 12 million arrests comes a critical decision, whether to release or detain a defendant pending trial, and if release, under what terms and conditions. The release detention decision has far-reaching impacts. It affects the fair administration of justice, the rights of victims, the rights of defendants, and financial expenditures. The effects of these critical decisions have greater impact or more far-reaching than may be readily apparent. It was once said that pretrial decisions determine mostly everything. What I find most fascinating about that is that it was said by Professor Caleb Foote when he was studying the issue of pretrial release and detention, but he said it in 1956. In the nearly 60 years since Professor Foote drew this conclusion, research has shown that release and detention impacts the disposition of the case, the likelihood of being incarcerated, and the length of incarceration, and public safety in both the short and long term. Last year, I had the honor of working with some colleagues, Dr. Lowenkamp and Dr. Holsinger, who's here with you this morning as well. And we undertook a study to look at the relationship between pretrial decision-making, pretrial detention, and sentencing. We also looked at pretrial detention and its relationship between new criminal activity, pretrial, and post-disposition. To conduct this study, we were able to access information on about 150,000 defendants who were arrested in Kentucky over a one-year period of time. We developed multivariate models to control for things such as the risk of a defendant using a validated risk assessment, the charge, offense, and level, the severity of the crime, if you will, the time at risk in the community, how long the defendant was at risk in the community, whether or not they were on probation and parole. We also looked at demographics such as age, gender, race, marital status, and other relevant factors. The idea here is that we can control for things that really may lead to the need to detain someone, and conversely, the likelihood of new arrest fail to appear and that they would be safe to be released in the community. So again, there were two parts to this study. The first one looked at pretrial detention and sentencing, and what we studied here was just whether or not a person secured release at any point pending trial, or whether or not they were detained pending trial. And we controlled for all those things, risk, charge severity, and so on. And what we found was that compared to similarly situated defendants who are released at some point pending trial, defendants who were detained were 4 times more likely to receive a jail sentence. And if they were low risk, they were 5 times more likely to receive a jail sentence. It was similar for prison. Very similar defendants. Those who were released, those who were detained. Those who were detained were 3 times more likely to receive a prison sentence. If they were low risk, they were 4 times more likely to receive a prison sentence. So release and detention status impact the likelihood of incarceration. We also found that it impacted the length of incarceration. Released defendants were received 3 times longer jail sentences and 2 times longer prison sentences, while controlling for all those other things. We also looked at the length of pretrial detention, and the idea here is that release and detention is not really an either-or proposition. Yes, people are released or they're detained pending their case, but even for people who are released, there's a difference between people who are released on one day. Sometimes it takes a few days to secure release, a week, a month, sometimes several months. So we looked here at all people who were released but we looked at what point they were released. How long were they detained before securing release? And when we compared defendants who secured release in 1 day, defendants who spent time in jail before securing release were more likely to commit new crime. We looked at this here during the pretrial stage. The longer it took for low-risk defendants to secure their release pending trial, the more likely they were to commit a new crime when they were released pending trial. We found something very similar post-disposition. The longer it took people to secure their release pretrial impacted new crime, just not pretrial, but 2 years post-disposition. This leads us to believe, and really confirms previous research, that release and detention decisions impact sentencing and length of sentencing. But this really gets us thinking that how long it takes a person to secure release has an impact on public safety as well. Recognizing the far-reaching implications of these critical pretrial decisions, one must ask themselves, how are these decisions being made? And the answer is many different ways. Pretrial decision-making practices vary widely across this country. Some use what's called the bail schedule, where it's literally a schedule, a list. It says, here's what you're charged with, and here's the amount of money that must be posted before you're released. Others employ staff, oftentimes non-attorneys, who make the decision based on their professional judgment. It's a subjective decision, either in person or sometimes by phone. While still others have the decision made by a judge at first appearance. But even then, the amount of information that's available to the judge to make that decision is very limited. In fact, there was a study done in one of the largest court systems in this country, and they found that the entire first appearance, which includes reading of charges, reading of rights, assignment of counsel, and a pretrial release and detention decision, that entire process takes about 30 seconds. And they studied it, they timed it, just like I'm being timed. And that's not unusual. If you go to courtrooms all across the country, if you were there today, you would see that's about how long we take to make this decision. Only about 10% of jurisdictions use any research-based objective tool to help identify the risk to public safety and failure to appear in court. A majority of jurisdictions have limited or no supervision or services to mitigate risk. Release or detention is often determined by a defendant's resources, being their financial resources, not the risk that they pose to the public or to failing to appear in court. The result of that is high-risk defendants are released and low-risk defendants are detained. Risk is inherent in pretrial release. Our system of justice requires that we take risk. So the question is not, do we take risk pretrial? The real question is, how well do we measure the risk and how well do we manage the risk? And the answer in most cases in this country is not well. I would argue that a system of justice that does not determine pretrial release and detention based on the risk posed by defendants is not a just system. We must completely re-engineer the way these critical and far-reaching decisions are made. We can do that by first measuring risk. We can employ objective and research-based risk assessment instruments to help identify the risk to public safety and the likelihood of failure to appear in court. We can measure that risk. The research shows that. And we can manage the risk. We can implement supervision and services that are intended to mitigate the risk that is posed by defendants pending trial. This newly re-engineered risk-based system would ensure that high-risk defendants are detained, moderate-risk defendants are released with supervision and services to mitigate the risk of pretrial failure, and that the lowest-risk defendants would be released at the earliest point possible with minimal or no supervision or services. Employing this risk-based pretrial decision-making process would improve public safety in both the short and long term. It would enhance the fair administration of justice. It would better protect the rights of victims. It would better protect the rights of defendants. It would reduce the burden on local taxpayers. In short, significantly improving pretrial release detention decision-making in this country could impact, well, mostly everything. Thank you.